Hello. Permit me to introduce myself. I am Abby Hadassah Smith. I am the youngest of 5 sisters, born in 1797, who grew up and lived in the sleepy and bucolic town of Glastonbury, Connecticut. The house we grew up in, now known as the Kimberly Mansion, was placed on the National Register in 1974. There is far too much to tell you about the lives of myself and my 4 sisters during those tumultuous days of the turn of the 18th century to the 19th century in America, in this brief bit of time we have available. But you can read all about it from a 20th century scholar, Dr. Susan Shaw, who resurrected our forgotten voices in a book detailing the history and contributions that were made by my family during our lifetimes. This next photo of myself and my older sister, Julia Evelina Smith, born in 1792, is a favorite of mine, for it is this very special lady with a very common name who accomplished what no man had ever done, who will be the primary focus of our attention. To begin this fascinating story, please let me give you a brief overview of the family into which we 5 girls were born. Our father, Zephaniah Hollister Smith, born in 1758, lived a life reflective of the shifting views and practices of an evolving American landscape regarding religion and social praxis. A man of great erudition, he was a young reformer, schooled at Yale, a linguist, and a mechanical genius. As an ordained minister, our father had the unique distinction of having not only excommunicated his entire congregation, but of having been excommunicated by them as well. All to do with the practices and dogmas of the churches with which he disagreed. His pastoral career morphed into a business career, which ultimately evolved into a legal career that had a definite impact on the way we were raised and what we came to believe about right and wrong. Although my older sister Lorilla was an artist in her own right, in 1832, my father commissioned the itinerant artist Erastus Salisbury Field to paint our portraits. Most are lost to history, but the paintings shown here represent the style in which my family lived and dressed. Our mother, Hannah Hadassah Smith, born in 1767, was an educated woman who was also a linguist, a mathematician, an astronomer, and a poet. A glass cage had been built for her at her home on the roof, which enabled her to study the stars and the planets well enough to tell the precise time during darkness and to set clocks to the minute of the day. Our 3 older sisters had been given remarkable names: Hansi Zephina, Cerinthia Secretia, and Lorilla Alaroila, perhaps to offset the plainness of Smith. And although individually gifted in the arts and letters, they lived largely unremarkable lives. On the other hand, Julia Evelina proved herself to be an outstanding talent whose intellect, perseverance, and faith drove her to accomplishments unimaginable for most, including the translation of the entire Holy Bible from the original languages 5 times on her own without formal education or training. Which is certainly not to say that we were not educated. gracious, no. In fact, we were a happy, inquisitive family with days spent at home studying the Bible, reading the newspapers, enjoying music, and discussing the literature of the day while learning from educated, informed parents who immersed us in the heady world of thoughts, ideas, and opinions, along with a devout life of worship and piety, governed as much by intellectual assent as personal conviction. We all attended some classes in women's schools and academies, and in some cases we even served as teachers, but we never took formalized programs or degrees. Once our father rejected the official church, we preferred our own family study to the ritual and hypocrisy of the church and its prophets. We believed that informed human intellect and pietistic worship would reveal God's truths and messages for righteous living as children of God. Thus, the profound interest that was cultivated in my sister Julia, particularly in 1842, at the age of 50, in the swirling controversies of the day related to the dates for the end of the world. Mr. William Miller, a Baptist preacher and one of several doomsday prophets, predicted that the end of the world would take place sometime in 1843 to 1844. His prophecies and messages were derived from biblical passages and numerological calculations, which, he determined, pointed to Christ's imminent return, rapturing the faithful who accepted his dire predictions and leaving the rest of the world to perdition. When Miller's predictions did not occur, many of the more than 100,000 people across the nation who had given up properties and had forsaken ties to churches and families suffered in what came to be known as the Great Disappointment, an understated moniker for the reaction of those who had vested themselves in Miller's erroneous teachings. Although our family had not gone so far as to divest itself of its worldly possessions and follow the Millerites in white robes up onto rooftops and mountaintops to watch for the return of Christ, Julia felt compelled to search the scriptures for herself in order to reconcile Miller's teachings and her own understandings of the teachings of the Holy Bible. Toward that end, in her mid-50s, she organized weekly Bible study with our family while she taught herself Hebrew as a companion to the Greek and Latin she already knew. She determined to know the exact meaning of every Greek and Hebrew word from which King James' 47 translators had taken their version of the Bible, and it was the literal meaning she was seeking. Joined by myself, who had a lifelong passion for the study of the scriptures, and our friend Emily Mosley, a renegade from the conventional churches, over the course of the next 7 years, and based upon our intensive, in-depth studies, Julia created her 5 translations of the Holy Bible from the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Those translations, which came to number some 10,000 pages of handwritten manuscript, and which were intended exclusively for personal deliberation, as amazing as they were, remained on the shelf in our home for some 20 years, until such time as Julia and I were pressed by the injustice of the law to take action to prove that a woman had done more than any man had ever done at that time in history, and that taxation without representation was not to be tolerated. It was this intolerance of injustice that was to catapult Julia and me into the limelight during the seniority of our lives. Julia chronicled all of these events in a 94-page pamphlet she collated in 1877, entitled Abby Smith and Her Cows, with a report of the law case decided contrary to law, which is actually a collection of newspaper clippings, articles, and letters selected specifically for the purpose of that publication. Julia chose to use my name on the title because I was the one who argued for pursuing the injustice of taxation without representation. Julia thought it might be better to submit to the local government's demands, but I was adamant that we challenge the preposterous and unfair laws toward women that treated us as non-citizens while gladly reaching into our pockets to pay for roads and repairs, which we did not authorize, from people we did not vote into office, who made the laws upon which we could not vote. Julia explained in the introduction to the pamphlet that the first time she ever said anything in self-defense was in 1869, when an overseer of the highway called in June and brought a bill of about $18 and said it was not due till fall, but wished we would furnish the money beforehand, for he must pay the laborers and could get no money from the men. Julia paid that bill, and the next October there was another highway tax bill sent of about the same amount. She thought there must be a mistake. She called on the overseer, but he seemed to know nothing about how it happened, and the bill was withdrawn only because of Julia's protest. In 1872, when Julia was 80 years old and I was 75, a collector Cornish came to collect taxes. Julia asked him why the assessment was more than the last year. She wrote that he told her that the assessor had a right to add to their tax as much as he pleased, and he had assessed their house and their homestead $100 more, which to be sure increased our tax but little, but what is unjust in least is unjust in much. When the collector was asked whether or not it was done so to any man's property, the man looked over his book to see, and not a man had his tax raised. There were only 2 widows in the neighborhood who were so used. In 1874, despite the fact that we had paid over $200 in taxes the prior year, and despite the fact that Collector Andrews had indicated to me that we could pay 12% interest for as long as we wished, until we could pay our next tax bill, just like the men, he came to our home on New Year's Day with some papers which were to be executed that very day, and proceeded to state that the law must be executed, and as he must take personal property first, our cows would be driven away at once unless the bill was settled right then, which we simply could not do. We had a fine lot of Alderney cows that my sister Julia had raised for amusement and was much attached to them. We wanted to petition the men to let us own our own land as they owned theirs, and then we would willingly pay our taxes, or at least to give us the privilege of paying 12% interest like the men. But we were only women and had no power, and they would not acquiesce. I went into the yard to entreat the men to leave 2 of the cows together, there were 8 of them, that one might not be left alone, but I could not prevail, and the little thing, the cow who was the poor person's portion, cried and cried. which is why the fight we fought with the governmental powers of the day came to be known as the bovine battle, as our beloved pet Alderney cows were conspicuously seized to pay our taxes at a public auction. A full parade, complete with a drum, led the 7 cows to that auction, where no man spoke to us, and it was rumored that the whole town was against us. We would not have believed the town could thus persecute women who were born and bred in Glastonbury, among the oldest and most law-abiding of its citizens. And although adamant about the injustice of taxation without representation, it was we who had actually paid the most money into the town's treasury. What happened after these governmental abuses and our refusal to comply with unfair practices which saw women as inept and cowardly is the stuff of newspaper articles, court appearances, and social activism, as word of our exploits and court trials made its way into the news of the day. The events that followed turned us into a cause célèbre, known throughout the nation and internationally as well. On November 5, 1873, after 2 delays, we were finally granted permission to address the Glastonbury town meeting. I am the one who actually spoke on behalf of Julia and myself at that meeting. As impassioned and articulate as I may have been, the town fathers remained unmoved and unrepentant, uttering not one single word when I concluded. What happened next was that the Springfield Republican, one of the most foresighted newspapers of the day, got wind of my impassioned speech and the chilly reception it had received, and 6 days later printed the entire speech word for word, along with our story and an editorial which stated the following: in refusing to continue paying heavier taxes year by year than any other property owners in Glastonbury, while refused a voice in assessing and spending them, Abby Smith and her sister as truly stand for the American principle as did the citizens who ripped open the tea chests in Boston Harbor or the farmers who leveled their muskets at Concord. We did not use tea chests or muskets to make our point, but at my age of 77 and Julia's age of 82, we began to travel, attend conventions and suffrage meetings, and insisted that the principles for which we were fighting be kept before the people. There are pages and pages of the records of our speeches and the subsequent law trials that came to take place as we made our way through the court system of the time, along with articles detailing our exploits and those of others fighting in their own ways for their voices to be heard. In the end, however, it would be the institution of marriage and not government which settled the law case once and for all. As a result of our unique religious upbringing and our early exposure to reformist understandings of justice as we served the poor and fought for the enslaved in our community, Julia and I had particularly strong antipathy to the injustices of American society as they manifested themselves in such abuses as a toleration for slavery and the inequality of taxation without representation. It was, however, our assertion that intellect knows no gender that would impel us forward to a project we had not intended. For over the course of our fight with the town fathers, we became convinced that we had the skill and intellect to resist and reveal wrongful government. As a way to demonstrate just how competent and skilled we really were, in January 1876, we contracted with the American Publishing Company of Hartford, Connecticut, to publish 1,000 copies of a redacted edition of the 10,000 pages of Julia's translations of the Holy Bible, which had languished on the shelf in our home for more than 20 years. We paid the $4,000 cost from our own personal funds. We decided to publish the Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, translated literally from the original tongues, which came to be known as the Alderney edition in memory of our dear cows, in the hopes, as Julia put it, that it might help our cause to have it known that a woman could do more than any man had ever done. The publication of the Holy Bible translation met with accolade from the suffragist community, but enjoyed limited success commercially. Although Julia and I insisted to reporters and others that we had no interest in making the project pay, Julia writing in her preface to the Bible that as object of publication was not profit, the price has been made very low in order to place it within the reach of all. The translation had been published rather to prove Julia's point that knowledge rules the world. As it turned out, Julia's translation eventually found its way into the famous Woman's Bible of 1895, which was edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other suffragists as the first Bible commentary produced exclusively by women scholars to serve as a commentary on the Bible, and which acknowledged the contribution to religious history made by my sister. Julia's translation was formulated on the basis of a literal translation of the original tongues. Julia also writing in the preface to her Bible that this translation will prove of great service to all who desire to read the Bible in its purity and who wish to apply their own judgment in deciding the meaning of the original terms. Such literal translations came to be made by other well-trained scholars after Julia, but the difficulties it sometimes produced were offset by wording that often brings us closer to the meanings of the original languages. One such example can be found in the Lord's Prayer in the New Testament. Julia's Bible translates the passage, "Our Father, which is in the heavens, let thy name be declared holy. Let thy kingdom come. Let thy will be as in heaven, also upon the earth. Give us this day our bread sufficient for sustenance, and let go to us our debts, as we let go to our debtors. And this should not lead us into temptation, but deliver thou us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." Julia recorded that she had invested in the 7 years of translation only for the love of doing it. And I told my good friend Lucy Stone that I would rather give everything I had in the world than not to have had that Holy Bible printed. As it turned out, after I passed away, Julia's judgment may have become clouded by her loneliness after losing all 4 of her sisters, all of whom had remained unmarried. At the age of 87, an octogenarian, she decided to marry a former judge based upon their mutual interest in the Bible Julia had produced. Connecticut law at that time, in 1879, mandated that a husband must pay his wife's debts. And although Julia urged her husband to refuse to pay the unfair taxes, given all the toil and tears that Julia and I had spent fighting such an egregious wrong, Judge Parker paid the outstanding tax bill and the case was closed. It is said that Julia repaid her husband for the exact amount of the tax debt, but that not surprisingly, their marriage was not congenial. Julia choosing to be buried with her sisters rather than her husband when she died at the age of 94 in 1886. Interestingly enough, the very same year that we published our Holy Bible was the very same year as the centennial birthday of the United States of America. America had changed in so many ways from the first days of its founding that in many ways it was hardly recognizable. However, in yet too many other ways, it remained firmly entrenched in the ways of the past that saw people of color inferior and women of no account. For in spite of the spirit of suffragism that emerged as part of the Reformation impetus that argued for individual rights no matter color, gender, or religious inclination, for women it would take yet another 30+ years to enfranchise the women's vote from the time of our deaths. And so it is that women living in the year 2020 have the privilege and pleasure of celebrating the first 100 years of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which boldly declares the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. I wanted to tell you our story because it is one of the many that should be retold as women of the 21st century stand on the shoulders of the women whose voices were stifled and forgotten in the dusty pages of history. Further, our story illuminates the truth that age need not be a barrier or hindrance for learning new things and for seizing opportunities to proclaim the right and to fight the wrong. Our determination to remain active and involved in our society, in our seniority, came as the natural outgrowth of the thinking that age had seasoned us as fine wine, and that what we had to say is valuable, no matter our age or our stage. All of which is to say that we challenge the women of the 21st century, particularly the young, to remember our story as they face the new hurdles and opportunities that confront them in the home, the marketplace, the political arena, and the wider world in which they serve, seeking to accomplish what no men or women have ever done before them. We are proud of the many contributions and sacrifices we have made, not only to the political growth and development of the country, but also to the study of the Bible and to the scholarly fields of theology and linguistics. And we urge our sisters to remember our stories as we raise our voices from the age of suffragism. Thank you.